presentation with lots of images, which I hope will be helpful because if you're anything like me, you maybe haven't heard of Claude. I have to admit that I had never heard of him before starting to work on this project. So it was quite a revelation to find out how much he intersects with, let's say, more renowned or more well-known figures of the avant-garde, people like Yves Klein and Paul Varillo. It's just fascinating. So I want to kind of do a brief overview of his career, just so you get an idea of what he's done in his 50-year plus career that makes it so exciting that we've managed to get this commission as part of the Biennial. And then at the end I want to actually talk in more detail about what the commission is, what he's producing for us in the Wolfson. Okay, it's still loading. So I'm going to do my first bit without images, because just imagine there's some pictures of buildings up here, okay? So he's like 90, Claude Perron, 91, born in 1923, French, incredibly vigorous and active still in his 90s, which I think is amazing, and I hope to be the same. And what's interesting is that he very much comes out of the school and the training of Le Corbusier. So there's that immediate lineage to the kind of main figure of architecture in the 20th century. There he is! Ooh. Hooray!
Oh no!
I thought I would start off with a picture of him so you know what he looks like. Okay, how do I get that bar away? Okay, we're sticking with the bar on the bottom, that's the least of our problems. So, as I was saying, by the time he kind of got into doing the work that he's most well known for now, he was already quite an established and commercially successful architect. He had spent, I think, about 18 months in Le Corbusier's studio working there, and by the time he was around 40, it seemed like he had a kind of very solid, safe architectural practice from which to go on working. And he had a number of key commissions before the point in his career in the mid-1960s where he had this kind of revelation which changed his entire practice from then on, and is what means the commission downstairs is operating in the way that it is operating. So, I'll show you some of those key earlier works first of all. Or will I? Seriously.
Do you want me to try and do it while you carry on?
Yeah, I'm just wondering why the click.
You just click onto the slide, I don't think it's. Click on his face.
Click on his face, okay.
And then it should take you on to the full screen slide, and now you can go next.
Ah, thank you, Jess. Other people who work at Tate can figure out the nastiness of the system. Okay, so, yeah, that's us. Okay, so this is one of his most famous earlier works, commissioned in 1959 by the artist André Bloch. And you can see what we're talking about here. It's sort of essentially an arrangement of elegantly stacked boxes, very much in the vernacular of Le Corbusier, with that quite interesting circular staircase on the outside, which maybe points to something a little bit different. But we're in that modernism vocabulary in terms of the middle of the 20th century, the French, I guess, leading the way in terms of this kind of renovation of how we think about building and construction in the last century. So he's demonstrating at this point very much a flair for creating statement architecture, big commissions, commissions for the right sort of people. But what was to happen was essentially a split with Le Corbusier, and indeed the split with the modernist aesthetic as a whole. So in a recent interview with Purple magazine, Claude Perron had said of his generation of French architects that we knew Le Corbusier's work by heart, we adored Le Corbusier, but we couldn't get close to him. He was surrounded by people, his inner circle. I'm a child of Le Corbusier. Later I was mean to him, telling him that right, because entire cities inspired by his theory, made of grids of residential towers, did not work. So here obviously he's referring to the kind of swathe of concrete tower housing blocks that I guess sprung up in the 1960s onwards as a result of Corbusier's work like Unité d'Habitation in Marseille, so they're really, really famous, very much working on the grid and working with concrete. So There was very much a reaction against that in the second half of the 20th century because it was seen to not work in creating these sort of towers in the sky where people were essentially quite isolated and didn't have full, meaningful lives. So I'm just thinking of the example in Glasgow of deciding to demolish the Red Road tower blocks, and at one point trying to do that as part of the opening of the Commonwealth Games. So it's still a kind of really present problem, the sort of legacy of the crumbling tower block that is in the wake of Le Corbusier. So it's quite interesting that Perron rebelled against that relatively early compared to a lot of other people. And that idea of rebelling against it for quite socialist reasons is also interesting in relation to his later practice. So he in fact left Le Corbusier's office in 1953, and it was because he won a competition launched by a new magazine to build a new house. So that's quite interesting. I'll just show you a couple of other of his earlier works. This is at the International City University in Paris, so that's slightly later than the André Bloch house, and you can see it's obviously on a more civic scale rather than the private commission that the Bloch house was for. And again with the sort of curve breaking free of the grid as an absolute structure. And then this is maybe what's considered his sort of transitional building, the Maison Druche in Versailles. So this was again a commission from a single individual, but you can see that the idea of breaking free of the grid and introducing the diagonal becomes more apparent here. And this is what really sets up his work that he's sort of cemented his reputation with. So I want to talk about the group that was formed and the principle that they set up that really comes out of this house and work immediately after. So this is the Architecture Principe group, which was founded in 1966, only a year after the Maison Druche house was completed. And I've just taken some quotes here from an article that I found really useful in Grey Room, which I can send to Charlotte for circulation, because it's a conversation between Paul Varillo, who also established the group, and Sylvain Lottinger. So I've just put those up for you to read because I think it says a lot about the kind of ideas swirling around at that time. And actually, I will go back to that in a second, but I want to talk about bunker architecture first of all. So, I was saying that Le Corbusier became kind of infamous for his use of concrete. And what's happening in this kind of strands of thought and everything swirling around in Perron's practice at the time is something that was mentioned to him by the writer and philosopher Paul Varillo. Particularly the Second World War bunkers that were built by German forces along the Atlantic Wall, which had sunk into the ground and become lopsided, sloping unnaturally, which you can see from these photographs which Varillo himself took. And from 42 to 44, the German army had in fact built 8,200 of these bunkers over a 2,500 kilometre stretch of coastline. They're thinking that it would impede an Allied landing. I don't think that really was successful as a theory. So Varillo got Perron really interested in these structures, these kind of out of time and out of place structures really completely slipped out of all purpose and use. And so they visited the bunkers, and from then on, Perron really rarely looked at or imagined architecture in quite the same way. It really had a fundamental impact on his thinking. And his buildings began to incorporate inclines, slopes, and this sort of feeling of vertigo and disorientation, which we can locate in the bunker architecture. That Varillo would go on to, in fact, curate an exhibition around bunker architecture, write a book about it. It became a huge strand in his thinking. So you've got the concrete of Le Corbusier, and you've also got the concrete of the bunker architecture. And I think it's quite important to point out the sort of importance of concrete as a post-war psychological signifier at the time, and the relationship between this bunker architecture and brutalism, which is what the post-Le Corbusier strand of architecture became known as. This idea of exposed rough concrete in large modernist block forms, which really flourished in the 60s and 70s. So, going back, out of all of this kind of, is that the rain? Yeah, it's really loud, isn't it? Out of all of this sort of swirling of ideas and theories and interlocking references to the very recent past of the war and the attempts to rebuild society after this total destruction and trauma, emerged this group, Architecture Principe, which was formed by Claude, the philosopher Briot, the painter Michel Carrade, and the sculptor Maurice Lipsy. So it was a kind of multidisciplinary group, as you can see, and these were really in vogue at the beginning of the 60s. And in fact, Perron, this was really a continuation of his other ways of working like this. He had been included in the Espace group, which was founded by André Bloch, who was the person who designed the house for I showed you earlier. And the most important sort of development of this group was the founding or the development of the theory known as the oblique function. So it became a manifesto for this group, and this was really written jointly by Briot and Perron in 1966. And really what this boiled down to was that they decided that the widely accepted rules of architecture, straight walls, flat surfaces, working with cubes and rectangles, no longer applied, that had no relationship to what they wanted to build and what they wanted to imagine as a space for living. And Perron has said, again, this is from a more recent interview, but it's quite a great quote. Each time you build a wall, you commit a crime, which gives you a sense of his sort of strength of feeling of this whole idea. So what exactly was the oblique function? For this group, it was a means of appropriating space, very much inspired by the kind of psychology around phenomenology and space and how a body occupies space, which really promoted a continuous fluid movement and forced the body to adapt to quite unstable situations. So again, getting away from the solidity and the regularity of a straight wall at 90 degrees. So it's really important to recognise the sense of disequilibrium, the sense of vertigo, that really provides the architecture for this kind of space that they were devising. And it was really experimental and provocative research. And it was fairly obscure in the scheme of things, but it did eventually find certain manifestations, such as a church, which was built in 1966 in France. So another thing that I think is quite interesting to point out is the quote at the bottom, which says, "There were no clients. People were afraid to live in the oblique." So this idea of living in slopes and on the diagonal, it didn't find any commercial success at this time. And to go back to the idea of vertigo, another quote from Briot says, "The idea is to create an architecture that plays off of disequilibrium. What puts us into a situation of disequilibrium is the inclined plane. We are always in the process of restructuring ourselves." So this is an interesting little diagram which shows you sort of in very neat terms the ideas around the oblique. So you have the two obliques on the bottom equaling multiplication, so equaling a kind of infinite number of possibilities, rather than the horizontal and the vertical just leading to more additions. So again, it's this tilting to 45 degrees rather than keeping everything on the right angle. It's a sort of very simple idea at its core, but it's what launched them onto this path. And then that's one of their joint drawings in the bottom right corner. So called again a sort of circulating habitat. So this you can see that it's more on a sort of scale of the city. So what they applied to singular rooms and singular buildings, they wanted to eventually multiply to entire cities, and building entire cities based on the oblique rather than on the straight and horizontal. And just to go back to that idea of the kind of psychological reference points for concrete, I think it's important to note this very clear link to bombings and to bunkers and the idea of having to go underground to protect yourself from the air raids. So Briot makes that explicit in many of his writings about bunker architecture. And I think that's quite interesting that the group as a whole were trying to update this kind of defensive architecture. So an architecture which resists man, which is an obstacle in its path. And the oblique thus participated in its own way in a tactical form of warfare. So the language is really combative, you can see, and I think that's quite interesting to keep that in mind, that it's very much a defensive posture, again, in relation to the sort of horrors of the war, which had only finished 20 years ago, was still, relatively recent. And a number of artworks that Perron himself has chosen to include in the structure here, again, relate to that sense of legacy. So this was the concrete, not to pun too much, realization of the oblique function, which is the church of Saint Bernadette du Bonlay at Nevers. And you can see the parallels with the bunkers built by the German army in the 40s are really, really obvious and clear, and it certainly does not look like a church in any traditional understanding of that building. And as you can imagine, it was really controversial at the time, and I think Perron actually risked being excommunicated at one point for building it, but it's now a listed building, so it's not in any danger. And you can see that on the outside, at least, that idea of rough exposed concrete is the most prominent feature, along with a kind of really, butting, sort of almost posturing bump coming out of the middle. There's no sort of attempt to smooth things over and make it aesthetically pleasing. And then I'll show you the inside here, which you can't really get a great sense of, but the crucial thing is that there's no flat floor in the church whatsoever. Everything's on a slight sloping angle or a slight oblique angle, and everything raises up to the pulpit. So it's this very disorientating, strangely vertigo-inducing space. And again, this is very, very strange to put in a place of worship where normally we're used to things being tranquil and unchanging. So why was it slopes? Why were they so interested in that? I think it's the idea that they really captivated Perron because he believed that they could bring about a change in post-war living. Again, he felt that a change was needed at this historical moment. And he believed that architecture had the potential to change our understanding and experience of the lived environment, and indeed the dynamics of our relationships with other people as they existed within these spaces. And again, in an interview quite recently in 2010, he explained that we're completely over-furnished. What would it be like, on the other hand, if space were understood more playfully, more free, if movement and being in a space could also mean climbing, reclining, sliding? So for him, it was about changing the dynamic by which we relate to the lived environment, other people, and the wider world. Or, as he's described it, architecture becomes the medium for staging human relationships. And this is true whether in a public space like a church, or indeed in a private space like his own home. And I want to show you now some pictures from the commission he did for the Venice Biennial in 1970 for the French pavilion, which I think really exemplify the idea of the oblique function in building inclines and sloping structures. And it gives you more of a sense because there's actually people in these photographs. So I'll just go through some of these. And again, this is a few years after he's developed the whole manifesto with Furiot. And you can see he's kind of becoming more confident about what this could mean, and also because it's for the Biennale, it's a temporary structure, and you can get more of a sense of provisionality when you compare it to the church, which is obviously a permanent place. So I love these photos where you can see where the wooden slopes really meet the architecture of the pavilion itself, the exposed brick walls, which is actually probably the most similar, the most kind of useful reference point compared to what will happen downstairs, and that there'll be a series of wood structures within our existing space, the Wolfson, and I'm going to show you some plans of that later. So it's slightly haphazard. You can see there's this real kind of sense of, in this one especially, sort of the architecture is almost bearing down on the people within it, and there's a real sense of it's quite a confrontational, overbearing experience, but that is supposed to produce something new. It's not supposed to be a kind of easy, straightforward experience. And then that's one of his drawings for this kind of structure. So you can see how it's very much dealing with various angles, various slopes, and how people relate to it. And his drawings are really interesting, and I feel that his drawing is fundamental to his practice. He doesn't use a computer, which I think is fair enough when you're 90, but I don't think he ever has, according to his assistant. So he's never become one of those architects who uses a computer to draft his work. He always works freehand with pen or pencil, and that's how he produces his ideas. So the drawing is really crucial to his thinking through a concept. And then this is getting into more the kind of thing that we hope to have downstairs, in that it's a series of slopes and inclines and ramps where people are invited to sit or to experience the artwork within that space in a new physical situation. So not the normal way that you experience artwork in a gallery. And then these I'm including because we've just confirmed that we're going to have some of his drawings, including this one, in our second floor display. So as the other part of the Biennial within Tate. And he's lending these from his own collection. So this is a device to eat. I think this is the, yeah. So that's the dining room device. So again, you can see there's no furniture as such. The architecture and the furniture are the same thing. And you can see, I mean, this is it's really modular, and it has that kind of, it looks like a piece of abstract sculpture. I mean, if I showed you that with no context, you'd think, is it like a Sol LeWitt drawing or Donald? It has a kind of reference to minimalism as well, and I think it will be really interesting to have that in the context of the second floor, which is a display about the domestic and how the space of the domestic interior and the home space can encroach upon the institutional space of the museum. So to have that link to the Wolfson, I think, will be really interesting, and have Perron represented there. So these are some photos of him in his house, just to illustrate how the oblique function works on a domestic scale as much as it works on a public scale, like in the church. And I've got a great quote from Perron's own daughter, who has recently written a foreword to a new publication on her father's work, and she's explained her own personal experience of what it meant to grow up in a house without furniture. And she said, "The extraordinary became everyday life. It was exciting for me as a child. I didn't belong to the bourgeois world any longer, in which you inherited valuable classic furniture from your ancestors and ate at a table surrounded by 6 chairs. We ate lying down at a small, flat table, which you could also lie under. At points there were soft spots embedded in the ramps that you couldn't see. Visitors would often scream in terror when they stepped on such a spot." So I think that's hilarious, the idea that the surface you're standing on would suddenly change in texture and stability, and you would have no idea that that was coming. And I can't imagine what it would have been like to live there. So you can see the soft furnishings and the art and the people all kind of merge into the space. And it just looks fantastic, actually. So that sort of really gives us a glimpse into how he lived with it, and he still lives with it. They still live in that house, and it's very much an ongoing concern for him. Although, as I said, nobody else really bought into it at the time they tried to launch it as an architectural practice. But I think you can see that his influence really lives on in architects like Ram Koolhaas and his former student, Jean Nouvel, who has said that nobody could win an elegance contest against Perron. So I think that's quite interesting that there is this lineage of people, and other writers have said, you know, we see the influence of Claude Perron, somebody like Zaha Hadid's work, which is very much, again, anti-rectilinear, anti that sort of rigid geometry and structuring device that is the enduring influence of Le Corbusier and his school. So I think that's interesting. He's starting to kind of be picked up again as this hugely influential figure for a number of the people who we would consider the sort of star-architects. I hate that word, but you know what I mean, like the people who are so unbelievably at the top of their game in the architectural world at the moment. I'm aware that I'm going on, so I'm just going to show you a bit of his other work. I think this is kind of an interesting thing as well, because it's a commissioned to build a supermarket in France, again at the tail end of the 60s. So you can see that the bunker architecture aesthetic really lives on and really continues, and this idea of hunkering down, and I would have no idea that that was a supermarket. It really does not look like one, but I love the idea that it's almost growing out of the concrete landscape of the car park, and that still exists there. It's still used and working as a supermarket. And then we get onto the commission that was to almost end his career, which I think is really important to talk about. He took on a commission to build nuclear power plants in 1975. So again, this is what is really a crucial turning point in his career, in that it's what provided the reason for him to split with Paul Virilio and the rest of that group. He essentially found a very, very purposeful outlet for his imagination and his creative practice in the great French nuclear power development project in the early 70s, which was huge and vast. And he worked with EDF and designed buildings for 2 power stations in northern France, completely from scratch. And he essentially refuted any notion of camouflage in their design. So he wanted to accentuate the new buildings and find the shapes of nuclear without spoiling the surrounding landscape. And he said the only route to take was the monumental. So Perron has been very outspoken about this, and people against him have been very outspoken about his decision to take this on. But he has, of course, recognised how controversial this whole commission became and the profoundly detrimental impact it had on his career as a whole. And he's commented that at the time there wasn't anything for me that was faster and more powerful than the atom. It was a huge feat to bring this energy into form, to tame it. I found everything having to do with atoms and particle acceleration good. It was great and modern. Back then you thought about atomic waste as little as you would think about car exhaust. It was that simple. So you can see his kind of rationale and his reasons for doing it, but of course Paul Virilio, on the other hand, has said that Perron's constructing of nuclear reactors was something he never would have consented to because he was against nuclear power, so that's where we really split up. And he's been very vocal about his feeling that he, after May 1968, went very much to the left, whereas Perron went to the right. So I think you can see that as a defining moment, but I would say that perhaps it's not as simple as Virilio suddenly being the left-wing figure and Perron being the right-wing figure in the partnership. I think it's more complicated than that, but it's certainly interesting to know that he did this and it's part of his legacy as an architect. And I just wanted to include this because I think it's a sort of great reference point for his thinking, and it's something that we're using as a sort of starting point for a seminar that will happen in September, which is being jointly hosted by the Architecture School at the University of Liverpool, the Biennial and Tate. So it's hopefully going to inspire and produce a whole series of papers from artists, architects, theorists, critics, responding to Perron's work and also sort of moving beyond it. So that's kind of interesting to keep an eye out on for the end of September. And I think obviously it really sums up a lot of his feelings against going against the mainstream, going against the grain of what's expected. Open the imaginary, operate in illusion, think continuity, surf on the surface is my particular favourite. So I just wanted to show this is a more recent drawing that he produced last year, and I think you can see starting to play with scale and moving into something that seems again quite monumental is quite an ongoing part of his practice. And there's a whole series of drawings that he's produced in the last 2 years, so he's still very active as a draftsman. So now we get to the commission downstairs. Well, not downstairs yet, but imminently. I wanted to show you some photos of the early cardboard models that they use in Perron's studio. So he works with 2 assistant architects to produce both the plans and the model. And while it's changed slightly since this version of it, I think it's quite nice to see it in 3D and to see how it relates to the drawings of the ramps and slopes with people on them. And the post-its are where the artworks are going to go, so you know that's what the pink bits are. And you know the space downstairs, it's the space you enter as soon as you are in the foyer of the gallery, and there'll be a central walkway down which you can access all of the different areas of the structure. So I was going to just bring up the plans, because I think it's just nice to see them and to get an idea of what's really happening. Okay, well, you're going to have to like turn your head. So, let's see if there's another one. It's very much related to the Venice Biennale commission I showed you earlier, in that it's a series of wooden ramps which are going to be painted a grey colour, and then a series of both opaque and transparent mesh walls. So there's going to be a sense of nothing's quite solid. There's always going to be the slippage between the solidity of the structure, or the room rather, that it's in, which is a stone floored room, the highest ceilings in the gallery, over 4 metres. And then what's encapsulated within it. And it's all been designed around the artworks in the collection that Perron himself has chosen. So he's applying the principle of the oblique function to the museum and changing the Wilson Gallery into what he's called a machine for viewing the artworks selected from the collection. And the slanted floors and ramps very much reconfigure the space. So that's it there, and then you can see the ramps here. One of the walls is going to be painted. So there's a huge range of different inclines and slopes and heights, so it's going to feel very sort of staggered, and you're going to really walk around the space discovering different pockets and areas which are slightly hidden from view, but everything's accessible from the main walkway. And what I want to talk about now is the idea that by doing this, he's essentially forcing the visitors to the museum, so the visitors to the Biennial and anyone else who happens to visit the space and chance upon it, he's forcing them to experience what are works in Tate's regular permanent collection, completely fresh and completely from a different perspective. And these are artists that have a kind of very clear parallel and relationship to Perron's stated interest in the idea of fluidity as a concern, but also to the idea of challenging authority. So he's seen himself very much as a reactionary figure against the establishment in France, and I think ever since the Nuclear Commission he's certainly not operated within the mainstream architectural channels and hasn't had any major commissions since then. So you can see sort of 40 years after that he's really developed a sense of himself as an outsider, somebody who can challenge sort of the accepted authority on what governs architecture and what is very slowly moving, really, in a sense. So, if I just show you the rest of this. I mean, I think it will be completely different when you see it in real life, because it's really hard to get a sense of the three-dimensional occupation of it, but I hope it's interesting to see that. And then I'm going to just talk briefly about the works themselves, starting with my favourite and Perron's favourite, which is the Francis Picabia fig leaf. So this work really is the relationship between the artist and the establishment, so the idea of censorship, which Perron feels he's very much experienced in relation to French authorities, and Picabia very much was a radical anti-establishment figure within the French avant-garde in the 1920s. So this work, the fig leaf, actually is painted over a work called Hot Lips, which is a great title, which caused a huge scandal in the Salon in 1921, so the year before this was painted, and he decided to paint over this scandalous painting with, in a very kind of joking, mocking way, a fig leaf. And I don't know if you can see the fig leaf, right? Yeah, it's quite dark, but it's an absolutely huge canvas. It's really monumentally scaled, and it has a completely uneven, fragile surface because there's another painting completely underneath it. And Perron's very much identified with this work, and it's mocking of the French establishment. So in Picabier's case, by referring to the kind of traditions of the academic art school and the reference to French drawing on the bottom. And there's a whole sort of layer of different meaning that Perron's picked up on and responded to. So I think that's really interesting. And again, it's something that provides this sort of link between different historic periods within the French avant-garde and across art and architecture. It blurs that division line between art and architecture. This is a Gabo work we'll have suspended in the space about 3 meters above floor level. And you can't tell from this PowerPoint, but it's 10 centimeters big. It's absolutely tiny. And we're actually having a second Gabo work, which will be in a vitrine as well. So I think Perron felt very closely connected to Gabo, particularly around ideas of spatial orientation and how you relate abstraction within a lived environment. So that's a kind of interesting link again. And then we've got 2 prints by Edward Wadsworth, the English vorticist painter. And this brings us back not to the Second World War, but obviously to the First. Wadsworth was a member of the vorticist group who were very much influenced both by Cubism and what was happening in France and the effect of the mechanization of military combat on the First World War. So there's this dual relationship between abstraction on the one hand and the military complex on the other. And it's manifested in works like these, which relates in a quite nice way to what will be outside of the gallery on the Edmund Gardner ship, the Dazzle ship commissioned by Carlos Cruz Diaz. So Wadsworth was responsible for overseeing the Dazzle painting of about 2,000 vessels. So there's a nice link between Perron, Wadsworth, and Cruz Diaz's commission outside, which hopefully will be something that you can discuss with people when they visit the space. And then we have this great Paul Nash painting. We'll have a couple of works by Paul Nash also upstairs in the second floor. But again, I feel that this really comes back to the question of abstraction and how abstraction can kind of seep or leach into the world as it's lived and experienced, which is obviously something that the oblique function deals with. And in this painting, it looks wholly abstract, but the circular motif is based on an electric globe lamp that Nash saw. So again, it's bringing together the technology with the kind of formalism of painting as it moved through the 20th century, which I think is very interesting, and I think it's something that Perron is responding to. And this one quite surprised me when it cropped up. I was like, why would this be in it? It's totally puzzling. But it's actually related to the air raids, and again, referring back to the Second World War. If you notice the dates, painted in 1944, and Paul Delvaux has said that he painted it during a bombing raid, during an air raid, and obviously the skeleton then begins to take on other types of association, and it's this blending of a sort of neoclassicism with surrealism, this time in Belgium, that I think it has something profoundly odd about it. But then you've also got to think about, well, the woman is reclining on the chaise longue, so there's something related to that idea of putting your body in not a rigid upright position, which obviously responds to the idea of using the ramps and the slopes as a kind of living space. And I think, again, it's not an obvious choice, which is quite good, and it's helpful that he's come in with obviously a completely fresh eye and is looking at the collection in ways that's entirely different to how we would look at it. And then there's a work by Babette Mangold, which is the only video work. Oh no, there's a Mark Lecky work as well. Sorry. This is the only projection work in the space, which is a film of the Judson Dance Theatre dancer Trisha Brown performing a piece from 1978, and Mangold simply filmed her performing it in the space. And I've included a quote again by Virilio on the slide because it's the idea that both Perron and Virilio considered the dancer to be the principal agent within the space of the oblique. So they've said that in integrating time and space, from the moment that you consider man in motion, the choreographic dimension, not simply geographic, the choreographic, the gesture of the body in space the question of time is raised in dance as an art of time, just like the theatre. So I think this is quite interesting, the fluidity of Trisha Bound's performance, the idea that it's partly improvised. The dancer being somebody that activates that space of the oblique, I think is very interesting, and hopefully the idea when people occupy the space and inhabit it, once it's open to the public, we can see different relationships evolving and how the use moves forward. And then finally, we have a work by Gustav Metzger, and this is quite interesting because of his quite noted anti-nuclear stance. So this is one of his autodestructive works, which really sought to highlight society's obsession with destruction and the damaging effects of machinery on life. So we again get back to this idea of everything's kind of trailing in the wake of the bunker architecture, the seismic effects of the post-war landscape on the European psyche. And it very much carries an anti-capitalist and anti-consumerist message. So again, that's interesting in relationship to the idea of Perrault's work divesting the human experience of furniture, so divesting the home of a lot of those goods that we think we need in order to live. I think that's quite interesting. And this particular work was first performed or demonstrated, as Metzger's preferred term, in 1960 in London. And it was performed by applying an acid solution to his canvas. And what you can see here is the re-performance, the remnants of that, which he did at Tate Britain in 2004. So what Tate has in its collection is the remnants of the autodestruction, the autodestructive artwork. And I think that has a very powerful link to a lot of the ideas that Perrault has explored both with Virilio and on his own across the course of his career. And just to briefly say before I finish that obviously this provides a very strong interplay between art and architecture. It is a literal bringing together of artwork with a profoundly different architectural space, and broadening that out to how we think about our habitats and how we live both in public and private spaces is definitely something that is then linked to different floors within Tate. So particularly we can say the exhibition Mondrian in his studios, which will open in a couple of weeks and will be on show while the Biennial's on. We'll have a full-scale recreation of his Paris studio. So this illustrates very vividly Mondrian's relationship to his surroundings and how those rigidly geometric abstract works come into being through an appreciation of that space and that architecture that he lived in. And then also the idea of the domestic as leaching into the gallery space is what we are exploring in the second floor collection display of works, again as part of A Needle Walks into a Haystack. So this idea of the domestic encroaching into the gallery is something that obviously finds interesting parallels with Perrault and the works that he's chosen to show. So I will finish there. Thank you.
To what extent do your interpretive texts on the art that you're displaying relate to the context of the environment and the artist's choice of those images, and to what extent is it based on just those images in their own right?
You mean like the captions and stuff?
Yeah,
like that?
yeah.
Well, I haven't written them yet, so I'll let you know. I think we're trying to slightly destabilize the normal Tate procedure for writing these things, because the whole point is that it's a collaboration. So if we don't think about how we would normally work, then it seems slightly pointless to do it. And essentially because we're giving the Wolfson over to somebody like Perrault, who comes with this whole lineage of theory and of challenging and testing out propositions, I think that we want to try and push that a little bit, but within limits, because I have to say that people always want really biographical and informative fact when they come into the space. So we're always asking, people are always asking our front of house staff, can we have more information, like can you tell us who Paul Delvaux is, you know, tell us about when Gabo made this work. So I think there is going to be a slight friction there, but what we would try and do is set up the wall text, so the interpretation, in the way that much about the relationship between Perron and his choices. It's his curatorial selection, in a sense, to set that up very much as the basis, and then supplementary information to maybe be available that goes into the finer grain, and that gives you the detail about, you know, Picabia getting kicked out of the salon and things like that, which you can never really go into in that much detail on the wall text. So I think it's about a balance, but hopefully it's something that you feel you might want to sort of activate yourself, because a lot of the text is on the website in the form of catalogue entries and summaries and things like that, and it's all sort of quite freely available. And I think rather than trying to just replicate what's on the website in the gallery space, I think it's more interesting to have, for example, the mediators or the fellows, your interpretation of the work, because it's now so accessible and people can Google these things. I think it's more interesting to talk about, well, why have we done this in the first place and what's the relationship? So that would be my feeling. But as I say, it's a work in progress at the moment. Hi.
Do you think his use of the oblique was trying to turn architecture to something which is more like a natural environment?
Yeah.
Because there is a real tension there. The bunkers are visible in the environment, but sinking into the environment. So the brutalism is challenging it, but he seems to be going back into it and actually saying, you know, if you're living outside, we'll have to be sitting on the slope.
I think that's really interesting, actually. Yeah, I think that's quite a good point. Yeah, I think that's true, because you're getting rid of that.
We don't really have flatness in nature.
Yeah, exactly. You don't have a right angle. You don't have that kind of sense of the floor being this kind of perfect, safe finish.
If you're living in a cave, you're tend to go up an incline and the floor would be all over the place anyway, typically. So.
Yeah, you don't have control over that surface in the way that you do in a building. I think that's a really good point. And then that sets up a whole other chain of associations with other things.
Because it's more going back to it's criticism, but using slight modern theories and go back to that, but then put it in a very brutalist context and saying, actually, this might look out of place, but it's actually very, very natural when you think it through.
That's true, and it kind of relates back to the bunkers, and that what destabilizes them is the sand.
But they're also shelters,
yeah.
So they're also very human.
So they're just, the kind of like, that sense of shifting is quite interesting. Yeah, that's a great point. Okay.
Was he a religious person?
Well, I mean, I think he maybe like was Catholic in the sense that, you know, if you're raised in a certain religion, but I've never read anything that, you know, expresses that. And then I think the fact that he took on a commission to build a church means that he must have some kind of religious belief, if you see what I mean. I mean, it'd be quite odd to agree to build a church if you're an atheist. Maybe not. No?
Well, we should investigate.
Yeah, we should. Well, I'll send him an email. Do you believe in God? Question mark. I want to do that.
You mentioned.
Sorry. No,
you
it's fine.
mentioned that he said that the Wilson Gallery is going to be a machine for viewing the artwork. But you also mentioned that in all of his other architecture, he was talking about like the jarring landscape and the oblique, and how people didn't really respond to it in a domestic sense.
Yeah.
Is the machine, from his point of view, enhancing the artwork that's on show, or is it working in, I don't know, like a symbiotic nature with the artwork, or is it meant to work against it?
Again, excellent question. I would say if you look at the plans, he's considered meticulously the position of each artwork as an artwork, and it's been moved about several times, and it seems, from my understanding of it, that it is to enhance an experience of it, but maybe enhance is the wrong word. Maybe it's just more like shifting our experience of it. So again, we're used to seeing these things in a very much white cube setting, and I think it might be more about destabilizing that very safe relationship to the viewing experience, rather than saying one is better than the other. But I think it's a good point to note that there is an ambivalence there. I think that's really interesting.
So practical, do you he have any problems with access for people, say with wheelchairs and disabilities using the space? Is
Another
he
excellent
actually
question.
challenging? Is he
Yeah.
actually going to challenge the notion that everybody can access everything?
Well, this has come up obviously from our point of view because we have to consider those things as a public museum, and I would say that it's not 100% accessible,
Yeah.
but it's certainly something he's considered from conversations with his architect assistants. They know that it's something to think about now in maybe a way that you would never have to think of in the 60s and 70s, say. But I'm not sure, because I think ultimately the ramps in part are low enough that it should be accessible, but then there's certain points at which it's raised quite high in relationship to the floor, and we wouldn't be able to let somebody in a wheelchair safely go up there, so that will be something that we're addressing kind of in other ways, and I think it's something that you as people potentially in the space and being a biennial representative in the space might have to have a conversation about. But what we're planning on doing from a kind of Tate point of view is filming the experience of walking around it. I know this is kind of a sort of secondary experience, but it's similar in a way to what we have at the moment on the second floor with Tropicalia, the Elio Oiticica work, which is gravel. And you can't really go on it in a wheelchair, but it's very much part of the work that it's gravel within the gallery. So you have to balance the accessibility issue with the fundamental principle of the artwork as it exists. So I think that Perron's in a similar position in that the central atrium or axis that runs from the doors of the Wolfson right the way to the back is completely flat. So anybody can go right the way into the structure as deep as it goes and access certain levels on it, but perhaps not all of it. But I think it's a good point, and it's something that it wouldn't be his design if we asked him to modify it to that extent, but there's a certain concession to try and make it, let's say, somewhat accessible. Yeah. We'll see what happens though.
Have you had any problems then in terms of inclusion?
Pardon?
You know what you were saying in terms of disability, because obviously the floor's going to go up and down. And
Yeah.
Does that mean not being inclusive to everyone?
Yeah. I mean,
how are you going to make sure that it's inclusive?
It's not always about those analysis.
that's what I was just saying. Like, we want to try and make it inclusive by, if people can't access, say, one or two of the highest ramps, there's information, like for example, a film on an iPad which shows everything as you would access it walking there. So if there's a work, say one of the Wadsworth prints that they can't see, there's information about that, and a film that shows how you would walk around it.
So it's as interactive as possible.
Yeah, I mean, it's always a compromise, of course. It's not an ideal solution, but then it would also be a compromise to change the design to a certain point, if you see what I mean.
Oh, perfect. Yeah, I was thinking it's a quarter to 8, so maybe we should